No.
Well, good evening from a rather cloudy, wintry London, and welcome on behalf of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Our mission, as many of you know, is to raise awareness of the history and culture and heritage of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We have a website, www.harif.org. You're welcome to subscribe if you're not already there in order to receive details of our regular Zooms. We also have a sister website, which is like a news blog, has about 6,000 items on it, and you can subscribe to that too. The easiest way to get to it is to click on news on the Harif website. We are recording this session, and the recording should be up within a matter of hours. It's also being live streamed to the Harif Facebook page. If you would like to ask our speaker a question or make a comment, you're welcome to do so after she has finished her presentation, but please do use your real name, because anyone who is iPad or Rabbi or Wonder Woman won't be allowed to ask a question for security reasons, as we don't have registration. So on to the topic of tonight's talk. The 7th of October Hamas massacre was the most recent in a long line of pogroms to afflict Middle Eastern and North African Jews in modern times. And this month we commemorate the 83rd anniversary of the Farhud massacre of June 1941, which claimed the lives of at least 180 Jews in Iraq. Apart from Lawrence, our technical expert, and myself, Harif is run by a group of volunteers. And Michelle Huberman is an invaluable member of the team. She is Harif's creative director. And tonight, she's going to share a visual presentation detailing some of the massacres and murderous riots suffered by Middle Eastern and North African Jews over the last 100 years. So it is my great pleasure to ask Michelle to present her talk. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. It's funny to be on the other side here. I'm normally sitting quietly observing everything. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start off with the Farhud, and then we'll explain similar events which weren't recorded with body cams, etc., that we've all learnt now to see all of the gory details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And press play. Can everybody see it?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Is that good? Okie dokie. So last night was the 83rd anniversary of the Farhud in the Georgian calendar, although in the Hebrew calendar, it's actually next Wednesday, the 12th of June, because that's when this terrible pogrom that raged against the Jews happened during the festival of Shavuot. The Farhud is Arabic for forced dispossession. And we've actually got some good news, because last week the Knesset gave a preliminary approval to a bill sponsored by MK Ophir Katz of Likud, calling for an annual commemoration day for the Farhud to be held annually in June. And he's actually the grandson of a Farhud survivor. So that's very good that it's being acknowledged. So it actually happened in 1941 in Baghdad. And let's just move along here. Let's just, right, okay. So we can see it's a city which has had a third of its population Jewish. And the Jews had really prospered in Iraq, especially during the colonial rule of the British after World War I. But the community had actually lived here for 2,700 years, after the Babylonian exile. So in April 1941, as Field Marshal Rommel raised hopes of a Nazi victory in North Africa, pro-Nazi officers led by Rashid Ali al-Khalani staged a successful coup in Iraq. And the German-backed Rashid Ali and his men were soon routed by British troops, but not before the infamous Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was then in exile in Baghdad with 400 Palestinian emigres, had incited murder and mayhem against the Jewish Fifth Column. So on June the 1st, 1941, believing that the danger was over, a group of Jews who were wearing their Shavuot vest ventured for the first time in weeks to greet the returning pro-British regent, only to be ambushed by an armed mob. Terrified Jews barricaded themselves inside their houses or ran across the rooftops. Now, the rioting actually went on for 2 days because the British army, which was camped outside the gates of Baghdad, refused to quell it sooner. And around 180 Jews died in Baghdad and Basra. The figure is not exact, and it really varies on different reports. All of my research is different figures. Some people actually say between 400 and 900, but nobody can put a definite figure on it, especially when whole families died. So, and hundreds were wounded. And some of the wounded were actually poisoned afterwards in the hospital by the doctors and nurses who were supposed to be treating them. 900 homes and 586 Jewish-owned shops were destroyed. Houses were looted to the last object. Women raped, babies mutilated, and unlike today's barbarians in Gaza, there were no body cams to record the atrocities or social media upon which to share it. We only have the testimonies of those that have experienced it. So we're going to show you here, I've got some pictures. This was in the Jewish quarter, so we can see the shops, we can see the buildings and how they were. And what's very interesting here, and it's the same across the Jewish communities in the Middle East, is the balconies on the outside, because I know in Muslim society, they don't have the balconies on the outside. It's always like the courtyard inside, so that nobody can look into the women. Women can't stand onto the balconies. And you can see they're joined, and you can see the roofs are all flat, and people dried their fruits here. And if it's really hot, you'd sleep out in the top. But these were also the escape routes. So now here's some pictures of the streets. And last year, I was at the Babylonian Heritage Museum in Or Yehuda, which is a fantastic place. And they've made all these replicas. And when I was thinking, gosh, how am I going to illustrate this when there's no photos, no one had their iPhones with them to take the pictures. But in the museum, they've got really fantastic replicas of the area, everything. So you can see here, like the little fabric shops and the goldsmith, the jewelers, and you really get that feeling that you're actually in Baghdad. There's artists who've produced various different pictures to replicate. This is by Bettina Caro. This is one that I did for our this is a digital version that I did for our 75th Farhud anniversary. That was to replicate the blood. This was one of the survivors, Nessim Zalayet, who this was his memories. So you can see they're all pretty traumatic. And this one here was in the mass grave, and I'm going to explain why I did this in orange. Over the years, like I said, I think I've been 16 years with Harif. I've listened to various different testimonies from survivors and how they escaped running roof to roof. So I'm going to read from Leah Abudia, who now lives in Israel, and she was a child at the time of the pogrom. And in her words, she said, I watched people killing at least 4 to 5 Jews in front of me. Every car that passed by was stopped by the mob that pulled Jews out and killed them. I heard they killed 20 to 25 people in the airport area. Abudia and the others who experienced the 2 days of horror will never forget standing on the rooftops of their houses as the violence started on the first night. For many, the first warning was a dull orange glow that appeared over the very heart of the city centre, where the Jews and the Muslim communities joined together. Then there came the distant screams and banging, which grew louder as looters moved deeper into the Jewish neighbourhoods. Finally, up close, there was the horrifying sight of the neighbours desperately trying to leap for their children to an adjoining rooftop as armed men broke down their doors. That night, we heard screams coming out of the houses of the Jews, another survivor said. They were killed and their homes were pillaged, and this continued for less than 24 hours. The next day, approximately at noon, the Regent Abdul Ilah issued an order to fire on the mobs. This was the next day, and he could have done it the same day, of course, before things got worse, but he preferred not to interfere so the mob could release their anger at the Jews. So this was me taking the grave and that feeling of the first image of the orange smoke coming out. Now, we're going to next go to the testimony of Yaakov ben Zion. This is from the Babylonian Heritage Museum. And you can, hang on, let's just see if it's going to work. Make sure it's, there we go.
כל הזמן היו יריות. הבנתי שמשהו לא בסדר. כולם פוחדים, כולם בוכים, כולם צועקים בבית. ואז דפקו בדלת, דפקו, תפסתי את השמלה של אמא שלי והייתי כל הזמן אחריה. אלה שנכנסו היו שכנים לנו שהיה להם חנויות מכרו גלידה. אמא שלי אמרה להם, الحوش والغراض مالكم, اخذوا جدد تردون, اخذ. התחילו להוציא. טח, כמו, אתה יודע, שרשרת. פתאום נכנס שוטר. שוטר מדהים. סידרה, כובע זה סירה, מדהים של שוטר, עם רובה ביד, ונכנס. אמר, הנה על דינכם ודין פלסטין, וין صارت? זוכרת המילים האלה. טרח, נתן לה כדור בראש, לאמא שלי, אני הייתה עומד אחריה. נתן לה כדור בראש, נפלה. איך שהיא נפלה, אני ברחתי, נהייתי אחריו. אחותי יותר מבוגרת ממני, בשנה, שנתיים, אז היא באה, צעקה, אמא, הרג אותה על ידה. סבתא, מי המרתף? צעקה על אמא שלי, חיילה, איך שהיא באה להתקרבה על המדרגות, היא לא הייתה רואה טוב, הרג אותה במקום. תפסו את אח שלי, שם אותו למעלה, רצו לשחוט אותו. אז אחותי למטה התחננה עליו, ואמרה לו, תינוק, מה אתה הורג אותו? אני הייתי בן 6, הוא היה בן 4. למה אתה הורג אותו? בסוף זרק לה אותו. בדודה שלי רצה אחריו, הוא לא הרג אף אחד, מה היה זורק, תפס אותה בעליית המדרגות, חתך לה את הבטן, חתך לה את היד, זרק אותה. כל המעיים שלה נשפכו החוצה. הייתי רועד, הלכתי אחרי הספות, היה לנו תחות. אחרי הספות, אני הבנתי שזה הולך להרוג, באתי לדלת, היה עמד מישהו ככה, תפס את הדלת, ואני בתור ילד קטן, נכנסתי לו מפה, תפסתי את הכביש, התחלתי לרוץ לכיוון בית דודה שלי. אבא שלי שם. פחד, אני רץ, קופץ על הגוויות, היו 3 גוויות. והגעתי שם, דפק בדלת, פתחו את הדלת, אמרו לי, מה קרה? אמרתי, הרגו את כולם. אמרתי להם, התחילו צעקות. נתפסתי בהלם, היה להם נדנדה, ישבתי בנדנדה, וזהו, לא מדבר יותר.
Okay, so how familiar did that testimony sound? It really, when I listened to it, when I chose it, it felt like it could be somebody who survived 7/10. And, you know, everybody, Jews and right-minded people around the world, are shocked by the Barbary. And even amongst the hostages holed up in Gaza is a Farhud survivor, Shlomo Mansour, who went through that. And we don't know whether he's dead or alive. So our prayers are really with him. Sadly, to those familiar with Jewish history from the Middle East and North Africa, these were not isolated incidents. They have happened so many times before. But because there's no photo or video footage and they've disappeared into the footnotes of dusty history books, but after 7/10, the events were so similar to the testimonies that I've heard over the last 16 years that I've been with Harif, that I've tried to make afterwards. I tried to make a punchy poster, you know, just a list of all the different pogroms in the last 100 years. And I just stared at this piece of paper because I couldn't do it justice, just writing a line, you know, because there were so many in 100 years. So I felt that I wanted to do this short presentation, and there's quite a lot to fit in. So I'm trying to do it geographically by starting in Morocco. And we're going to start in 1907 in Morocco, and we're going to work our way across North Africa. So let's just check. Yeah, here we go. So this is what was called the bombardment of Casablanca in the Jewish Mellah, and where there were more, where 60 Jews were actually killed, more were wounded, a large number of women and children were kidnapped by the Kabyle Muslims from the mountain region. And again, in 1942, there were riots in Casablanca. But if you look at the picture here, you can see the same stories that we've experienced on 7/10, proudly holding up the head of a beheaded Jew, the slaughter. I mean, the fact that people can be so proud of this. So it's very, very tragic. And so then we're going to move from Casablanca to Fez 5 years later. This is in 1912. And there was what was called the Tritel. It was the pogrom in Fez, in which resulted in 45 being killed, 70 were injured. The anger of the Arabs was aroused by the agreement with the French authorities and the Sultan making French a protectorate. So the Muslims saw this agreement as a betrayal, and they turned their anger against who else other than the Jews, the traditional scapegoat. So the rioting mob invaded the Jewish Mellah of Fez. They ransacked and destroyed it and murdered some of its residents. The barbaric scenes resembled an apocalyptic vision, and as a result, 12,000 inhabitants from the Mellah fled. They were homeless and in dreadful need for weeks. And in fact, if we look at the pictures here, that I found, you can actually see on the one on the bottom left, you can see they actually find shelter in the lion's den, literally next door there for safety. So, and then you can see afterwards where they're looking through all of the rubble. So this is absolutely terrible. And I've actually visited the place where it happened in Fez. And these are actually just some of my photos from Fez that I've added. This is the Jewish Mellah, not that any Jews live there anymore, but again, like I was explaining in Baghdad, you've got the architecture with the balconies on the front. This is the cemetery. You can see the style there, but this is where the victims were buried. So now we are going to move again, still sadly in, whoops, let's go back, in Morocco. I've used all of Martin Gilbert's maps here, which show you what's what. So these were in 1948, so it just didn't stop. So after so much happened after the declaration of the State of Israel, Oujda and Gerarda, which are on the border with Algeria, 49 Jews were killed, 644 injured, and 920 were left homeless. These were actually the places, because you couldn't leave Morocco, and so people used to go across the border, and that was their exit route. So Moroccan Jews, yes, I've just said that. So, and there were more riots and Jewish deaths in 1955 in Safi and Udzem, as well as the earlier ones scattered around in 1903. I mean, this map that I've got here just covers the last 100 years. I mean, I could go on forever. It was very difficult doing this to know exactly at which point to start and which to stop, because as you're doing your research, you're finding more. And in fact, when I was looking through Martin Gilbert's Jewish History Atlas, you know, there's more here you can see on here. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend the book. So now we are going to move to Algeria. And again, so many more came up, and I just wanted to mention, because I know I've heard so many testimonies about what happened in 1934 in Constantine, where the local Jewish community, which was rooted in a different manner in which Jews and Muslims had been treated by Algeria, because they were actually the French colonial government. And it's uncertain what the exact cause of the riots was, although various accounts suggest that the riots were triggered by an altercation between a Jewish man and some Muslims at the Sidi Lakhdar mosque. Multiple sources report that 25 Jews were killed over the course of the three-day riot, and several Jewish establishments were pillaged. And we can see here on the right is the Sidi Lakhdar mosque, and on the left, this is after the riots. You can see all of the all the shops have been looted, and one can only imagine how terrible it must have been. Next, we're going to Tunisia, which did not escape riots, even though there were good relations previously. Gabes, which I've circled there, 7 were killed in the riots, a notable exception to the relatively good relationships. It was the worst outbreak of violence against Jews in North Africa during World War II. Now, next, we're going to Libya. And, you know, I show the film The Forgotten Refugees a lot. I take it into schools, synagogues, anybody will have me, actually. And it's full of very good testimonies. And this gentleman here, Yitzhak Davash, he was a survivor of the riots in 1945. And I don't know if you can see his hand, where they tried with an axe to chop his hands off during the riots. So 1945, in Tripoli, 140 killed. In 1948, another 13 killed. There was hundreds injured. 1967, absolutely terrible. Another 10 killed in Benghazi, 14 killed. And also the Forgotten Refugees has got some excellent testimonies of people who escaped from our sister organization in America. Gina Waldman talks about escaping and how the British helped her. And you can see here this lovely photo. This is how they dressed at the time. This is Vivian Varda with her sister Yvonne. This is in 1940. Next, we are moving, so you can see there on the map, so you can see these cities, Benghazi, Tripoli. And we are now going to go to the Jews of Egypt, where I couldn't find any pictures. All I had was a painting, a copy of the painting, which was done by Camille Fox, who I interviewed, I think 2 years ago, who did this beautiful painting of leaving Alexandria in, whoops, hang on, just moved up the wrong way. But in Egypt, in 1945, Cairo and Alexandria, 6 were killed in the Balfour Day riots. In 1948, there were between 70 and 200 killed, and there were savage mutilations like we've seen previously and very recently. So there's absolutely no photos for them. Now we're going to move down. Everywhere has these atrocities. It's really terrible, to Aden. And you can see here, there were riots in 1947, which targeted the Jewish community. 82 were killed, 76 injured, as well as wide-scale devastation of the local Jewish community of Aden. The riots broke out from a planned 3-day Arab general strike in protest at the UN Resolution 181, which created the partition plan for Palestine. In 1967, there were further riots, and the Jews were trapped in the Crater district in the port city, and they were attacked by the armed mob. There were 2 brutally murdered. The third was found alive, but barely able to talk. And fortunately, the British soldiers supervised their evacuation. Most went to Israel, but we've got quite a sizable community here in London as well. You can see here where I've circled Aden, which was next to Yemen, but they were different communities, although with some of the riots in Yemen, which were before this period, some had escaped over the border to Aden. So now we are going to Palestine under the British mandate. And so we are starting here in 1920, when there were the Nebi Musa riots, or known as the Jerusalem riots, that took place in British-controlled part of the occupied enemy territory administration between Sunday, April the 4th and Wednesday the 7th. It was around the Old City. 5 Jews were killed and several hundred injured. The riots coincided with what was named after the Nebi Musa festival, which was held every year on Easter Sunday and followed rising tensions in Arab-Jewish relations. The events came shortly after the Battle of Tel Hai and the increasing pressure on Arab nationalists in Syria in the course of the Franco-Syrian War. Speeches were given by Arab religious leaders during the festival, in which large numbers of Muslims traditionally gathered for a religious procession, which included slogans like we see in London, reference Zionists and previous confrontations around Jewish villages. The trigger which turned the procession into a riot is not known with certainty. Now, the Jaffa riots of May 1921 were a series of violent riots in Mandatory Palestine, which began as a confrontation between 2 Jewish groups, but developed in an attack by Arabs on Jews and then reprisal attacks by Jews on Arabs. And when I was researching this, I really found this very, very tragic, because we remember before the attacks, of the tension between different fractions in Israel and the Arabs taking advantage of the weaknesses and the fighting between ourselves. So I found that particularly upsetting reading this. I mean, all of it's upsetting. So the rioting in Jaffa spread to other parts of the country. It resulted in the deaths of 47 Jews, 48 Arabs, and 146 Jews wounded. Dozens of British, Arab, and Jewish witnesses all reported that Arab men bearing clubs, knives, swords, and some pistols broke into Jewish buildings and murdered their inhabitants, while the women followed to loot the homes. They attacked Jewish pedestrians and destroyed Jewish homes and stores. They beat and killed Jews in their homes, including children, and in some cases, split open the victims' skulls. Nothing seems to change. So 1929, okay, so the Arab riots that erupted then were known as the Western Wall riots. And these were the results of disputes between Muslims and Jews over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Demonstrations escalated in weeks of riots and violence beginning in August of 1929. So there was the infamous Hebron massacre, where 67 Jews were killed, 23 in one house alone, others tortured and bodies dismembered. On the 24th of August, in Hebron, then part of the mandatory Palestine, the Arabs incited violence by rumors that Jews planned to seize control of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The event also left scores seriously wounded or maimed. Jewish homes were pillaged and synagogues were ransacked. Some of the 435 Jews in Hebron who survived were hidden by local Arab families, although the extent of this phenomenon is debated. Soon after, all the Hebron Jews were evacuated by the British authorities. Many returned in 1931, but almost all were evacuated at the outbreak of the 1936 to 39 Arab revolt in Palestine. And the massacre formed part of the 1929 riots. The massacre, together with that of the Jews of Sfat, sent total shockwaves through Jewish communities in Palestine around the world. And it led to the reorganization and development of the Jewish parliamentary organization, the Haganah, which later became the IDF. So I'm just looking at the pictures here. We can see with Jerusalem there and everybody leaving and what happened in Sfat. Then we have the Hadassah convoy. And this was a massacre which took place in Jerusalem on April the 13th, 1948, when a convoy which was bringing medical supplies to the hospital was ambushed by Arab forces. 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, students, patients, faculty members, and Haganah fighters, and one British soldier were killed in the attack, including 23 women. And there were dozens of unidentified bodies burned beyond recognition, and they were buried in a mass grave. So this is Aleppo, and I have a problem here because I can't actually read the notes because I hadn't actually put them here. So and it's not showing. I've enlarged my screen. Lynn, would you like to read what I've put there for Aleppo?
I can't see the first sentence, unfortunately.
Can't you either? Oh gosh, yes, it's kind of, I don't know if I can shrink it down. But this is what happened in Aleppo. And to hand, I'm terrible at remembering numbers, which is why I always have to read it. And I put it on the top here. And I'm just trying to work out how to shrink it down.
It was an attack that followed the passing of the partition plan in the UN in November 1940.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you say 75 Jews were murdered, several hundred wounded. Actually, that figure of 75 Jews is disputed. Some people say no Jews actually died, but there was a huge amount of destruction, looting, and of course you've got a picture there of the great synagogue in Aleppo, which was completely wrecked.
These things are so hard to prove when so many people are murdered, and you know, it's a really difficult thing. I mean, I chose this to actually finish on because it can just go on forever with the research and how many smaller ones there were in Persia and Shiraz, and it was very difficult putting this together to know exactly how many, and could our audience stomach it all, of hearing the whole repetition. But there's so much to learn, because so many people I meet just believe that what's happened on 7/10 is like the first time that this has happened in the Middle East. So I'm going to finish the presentation on this point here, and then we will go into discussion, questions, if that's okay.
It certainly is.
Stop your screen sharing, Michelle. I need you to take
Okay,
these.
sorry, hang on, stop screen sharing, hold on. Hang on. Yes, I'm trying to find
Yeah.
where the
You've done
I
it.
did it, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I did it from this.
well done, Michelle. I think that was a very succinct presentation with all the sort of imagery you could find. Really very difficult to find them, as you said. And it certainly puts the 7th of October into its Middle Eastern context, which is so often lacking, isn't it?
very much so. It's not mentioned, it's never mentioned. Everybody who reports about 7/10 isn't actually making the comparisons. I know myself how I always feared this, because I've heard so many testimonies. I always said, if ever they break through those borders, I know what they're going to do, because it's what they always do. The murders, the beheadings, the rapes, the mutilations, and there's zero satisfaction in having seen it happen. And so yes, it's but it is a repeat, and especially now seemed an appropriate time with the Farhud, when we have had testimonies recorded at the museum and in the films, etc.
Yeah, no, I think that was excellent. Thank you very much. I've forgotten what I want to say. Oh yeah, there was I think a question which I think I can answer from Bob about the shrine in Tunisia that was actually torched in November, I think it was, or was it October? It was October. It was the shrine of Rabbi Maravi in Gabes, or near Gabes. Gabes was, of course, the site of another pogrom in 1941. But this particular episode was a mob who went on the rampage, set fire to this shrine. No Jews live in Gabes anymore. Obviously, they've all left. But all they can do really is vent their frustration and their anger on sort of physical sites, you know, on synagogues and shrines. So, Michelle, I don't know if you want to answer any other questions.
Yes. Okay, so Alan can't turn on his video. Okay. So I'm just reading here. Under Vichy and other, this is from Yitzhak Kerem. Under Vichy and other investigations, King Mohammed V, there were riots against the Jews of Meknes, Casablanca, and Rabat in February 1942. It's the ones in Morocco. It's like you're constantly uncovering. As I was working on this, it's like, was I going to keep everybody for 3 hours going through all of the incidents in Morocco? That but it really helps you understand, because people say, oh, they just left because of Zionism. But I'm pretty sure that anybody who's experienced grandparents, don't tell the children. So all of who were the younger generation when they arrived, they're not anymore. They didn't get the feelings. It's like us all of a sudden today remembering everything that our grandparents told us, but we didn't actually believe it, when they said, oh, the anti-Semitism will come back, and living wonderful lives in the West, it's been hard to believe. And I think the same happened in Morocco. They had their opportunity there. So Lawrence's question here, the Sultan answer, the Sultan was responsible for protecting the Jews and offered the cages in his zoo as a safe place. Riots in Tripoli, 45, 48, 67, which I mentioned.
Yes,
Jay.
I think the book that Michelle was referring to is Martin Gilbert's book of maps, but what's it actually called?
Here we go. This is my Bible.
Yeah.
If you're a visual learner, this book's fantastic. It really is. I actually went and bought the Kindle version as well, so that it would make it easier for the presentation. And it's a very good way of grasping facts.
And of course, Professor Kerem says he interviewed loads of Iraqi Jews about the Farhud. Professor Kerem, perhaps you could tell us if we can see these interviews or read about them, or read on them. I know Salim Fattal, the late Salim Fattal, interviewed 100 Iraqi Jews for a TV program that was broadcast, I think, back in the 1970s. And I'm not sure if that has British subtitles, English subtitles, or is actually available on YouTube. Perhaps the people at Al Yehuda would know about that.
That's exactly what I was going to suggest, because Al Yehuda is really great, and there's so many screens as you go around it, explaining everything. Plus on YouTube, they've got their channel. That's where I took that interview from. So I'm pretty sure they're uploading as much as they can with all of the interviews.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment there from Richard Sassoon. I found out recently my great-grandfather perished in the Farhud. My son was researching our family tree and found the date of his death as the 2nd of June, 1941. His name was Menashe Meir Gurji. Wow. Well, Richard, make sure that his name is recorded at the Babylonian Heritage Center, because they have a Farhud room there and listing all the victims, and make sure that his name is there. What else have we got here? Yes, the Shiraz pogrom of 1910. I think the Jews of Iran are often forgotten in all this, aren't they?
It was very difficult one when I was working out, and I was finding so many more as I was going along, and I felt I would be traveling. I started off doing this by dates, and then I realized I couldn't, and so it was like you could keep going along. You could just find pogroms everywhere, sadly. So yes, sadly, there's far too many.
Yes. The Babylonian Heritage Center, Helen, is just outside Tel Aviv in a town called Or Yehuda, which has which I think 50% of the population of Or Yehuda is Iraqi Jews, and the rest of them are Libyan.
And there's an amazing Libyan there.
Yeah, there is also
Libyan museum a few doors away.
There too.
Check the times if you go to the Libyan Museum, because I arrived when they were closing. So after trekking across there, because I thought I could do the two in one day, and it was impossible. The Babylonian Museum, I was just so taken in by it all. And they've got upstairs, they've got like a Marbarot camp with suitcases, and it's just fantastic. And if you want to teach your children, it's a really fantastic place to go to. I was bowled over by it, as you can probably hear.
There's a question, I think this is addressed to Professor Kerem from Bob. Please explain the discrepancy between Muslim Besa and Muslim pogroms. Perhaps we can put Professor Kerem on?
Right, if we're going to put people on, they have to take all the people who
No,
are... No, darling, anyone.
Okay.
And I just have to take...
So can I just explain what Muslim Besa is? I think that was the code of...
Anyone who we don't know the name, I'm putting in the waiting room now. To reveal your name, you can come back in the meeting.
Okay, so Muslim Besa is like the code of honor that that allowed Muslims to protect, or that mandated Muslims to protect Jews, and that was very much the case in I think in Albania, where the population is Muslim, and Jews were protected during World War II by this code of honor. So correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Kerem, when you come on.
Right.
So there was another code I think which was practiced in Iraq, which I know of, called dakhila, which means that if the Jews called dakhila to a Muslim family or a Muslim, they were obliged to actually offer him or her protection. Right. Professor Kerem, we have you on. Hello?
Hello, you just need to unmute yourself. It's not.
Oops.
Right, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Lynn.
Yes, hello. Hi.
Yeah, you know, I would say, if we're generalizing, in the 20th century, you have a lot of sporadic riots by Muslims in North Africa and the Middle East. In the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims were much more moderate and tolerant of the Jews. In Iran, the Shiite Jews were very hostile for 400 years. And also in Yemen and in Aden, the Muslims were very hostile. But a little bit is obviously in the background of Zionism, but it's part of the Jews being a minority, an infidel, a dhimmi, all sorts. They had a protected status as a dhimmi, but it's a whole history in itself. I don't think we can generalize it all. And Albania is a little bit of a different culture, and because they were behind the Iron Curtain for many years, we don't know so much about them. And now it's all coming out. But part of the Albanians were Bektesh, which is a Sufi Muslim sect originally expelled from Turkey. They're very moderate, and they were very, very loose in Muslim practice. And today that's their international headquarters. But they saved maybe half the Jews in Albania. So there's many factors, and I think it's an issue of temperament, and in diverse regions there are different stories, and not everything was so grim and black. That's what I'll say.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. There's a question about the who was the regent referred to in Baghdad? Well, the regent was a man called Abdulillah, because the actual king was too young to take the throne in Iraq. His place was taken by his uncle. And as soon as the trouble started at the beginning of the Farhud, Abdulillah actually fled Baghdad. And he returned 2 days later, and that's when the British, who were backing the region, backing the pro-British regime, they decided to actually quell the riot. And that's when it came to an end on the 2nd of June, in the evening of the 2nd of June.
Ruby, Joe Samuels wants to ask a question.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Joe,
Joe?
back to unmute yourself. Joe, if you unmute
Yeah.
yourself. Great.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. I was 10 years old in Baghdad when the Farhud happened back in 1941. Our family were lucky that we moved from Taht al-Takia, that the Jewish quarter, to Babi Shargi, which is close to the Tigris River. My older brother, I was 10 years, my older brother, 16 years old, he took his bicycle to visit the cousins in the old city. And when he arrived, my two uncles' homes, the doors were broken and totally looted. He rushed back on the Rashid Street, the main street of Baghdad, where he saw the mobs stopping the minibuses, dragging the Jewish passengers, robbing them, and slaughtering them. So he had seen all the bodies there accumulated. He came back, and we were all traumatized. We put heavy furniture behind our main doors. As a young kid, I carried water with oil to be boiled on the roof in case of the mob comes in. We saw a single person passing with carrying some clothes, but fortunately, the mob didn't arrive to us. But it really, the memory of the Farhud for the last 2 months, from April 1st till the Farhud, that every day the newspaper Al Zaman and all the paper were advertising and saying how about the Jews are traitors, the Jews are not nationalists, and of course Radio Baghdad are declaring arrested Jews on spying to the British. Some were taken to torture, and this was a really dramatic. And I want to emphasize also that during the Farhud, there are some Muslims stood up in front of the Jewish homes and protected them. So I grew up, my father was a textile importer in Baghdad, and he had many Christian Muslim customers who praised they are, fearing God. So when I asked him what's happening, he said, son, don't judge people as a group. They are good Muslim and bad Muslims. So it was, the trauma of the Farhud remains with me. And of course, seeing October 7 massacre, really it's ignited that trauma again. And in 2020, at the age of 90, I wrote my memoir, Beyond the Rivers of Babylon, and I sent a copy to Lynn. She has a copy. And just 2 weeks ago, I was able to translate the book to Arabic, and the publisher actually in Baghdad, who sent me a picture of how it is displayed in Doha, Qatar, in the International Book Fair. So the memories of the Farhud remains, and I thank you so much for all the details that you explained of what is happening. And thank you, Lynn, also.
Thank you. I'll have to
Yeah.
borrow that book.
Yes, yes. I will put something up on the news blog about the fact that your book has been translated into Arabic, and many congratulations, Mabruk. I think it's very important to emphasize that Muslims did save Jews. I know certainly in my own family, my grandparents were given shelter in the neighbor's house, and there are many, many stories of Jews who were saved. But of course, it went both ways, didn't it? I mean, did you know people who were familiar to you who turned against Jews?
I have in my book, actually, I did testimonies. One from Steve Aker, who's the Muslim protected them, and Shaul Moshi, where his house was totally ransacked, and he described how one of the workers at the like a smith on the street came in, and they both all of them ran across the neighbor's house, but his mother was too old, and this Muslim caught up with them, and he threatened to kill his brother, but he begged and he asked them, take everything in the house, all is yours, just like your mother, and let us live across to the neighbor. So he allowed them. So there are some, it's a terrible story that we all remember. And I continuously, speak at the Holocaust Museum and in different university and school, talking about the history of the Jews in Iraq and what happened in the Farhud.
Yeah, and you do very valuable work. We're very grateful to you, Joe. Actually, only just today, somebody told me the story about his uncle who was on one of those minibuses where they were pulling the Jews out and killing them during the Farhud. And apparently an attacker said to the driver of this minibus, who are the Jews on this bus? And the driver said, if I knew, I would kill them myself. And that way he actually saved this man.
It's amazing. That's,
Yeah, it's just today. No, it was something different. It was about Hitler.
No, only Baker, the one on the bus said he was a Christian.
Yeah. Well, no, my mother actually lived through it, but she was in an area called Bataween, which was actually not so badly affected.
Yeah, it's further than we lived with Babi Shargi. Bataween was next neighborhood that we lived there.
Yeah. That's right. So my mother tells the story, since Norris wants me to tell it, of this man who was knocking frantically on the door of my mother's house, asking to be let in, and he was ashen-faced, and he was her aunt's cook, and he had been on one of the minibuses. He was actually Jewish, but he pleaded for his life and said, no, I'm Christian, and ran as fast as he could.
Yeah.
So that's her little story.
And Lynn, you're quite right with the word dakhila. I mean, I am your, you're my protector. You're my savior, and I am yours as a slave. So they let them go sometimes. The beginning the dakhila. Yeah.
Right. Where did that come from? Actually, the dakhila, was it a Muslim thing? Was it a Bedouin thing?
I'm not sure, but it's an Arabic word.
Yeah.
That I am your under your protection, dakhila.
Right. And do you know people who actually said that word and they were protected? Do you know people?
No. As I said, at the time I was 10, my parents tried to protect me. They wouldn't tell me what is happening, but I could read the Arabic and I could listen to the radio. So I was really traumatic for 2 months. I actually went to sleep crying as a child. You didn't know where to go, what will happen. There was no place to hide, no place to run away to. And during the Farhud, I must add, there was no resistance and no fighting back. And even after the Farhud, no Jews could dare accuse anybody, any other Muslim, that what happened to them, because the fear it will be worse what happened to us, that will frighten not to mention what happened. So there's no arrest, no conviction, and it just went. Yeah, just.
And the official figure for the numbers of Jewish victims is 179. Is that an underestimate in your view?
Much, very, very underestimate. What I heard at the time that at least four or 500 were murdered, and some of them, they took them to the hospital and they were poisoned. Those who they thrown them over the Tigris from the bridge, nobody knew about them. Whole families were murdered, and so it definitely much lower than what is exactly happened. And it took a while, that the Jewish community recovered. When the British came in, actually they stayed outside the other side of the river, and they didn't enter. And they entered the second day on June 2nd in the afternoon, when they fired at the riots and they stopped it.
Yeah, Professor Kerem says 186 is the number of identified Jews killed.
Somewhere around there.
Obviously, as you say, if whole families were killed, there was no one really to witness their murder. So, yeah, some people say up to 1,000 were killed. I don't know if
yeah, I
There's
read
no-
up to 900 when
Read that,
I was reading loads of different reports and things. So very difficult to know, especially if whole families have gone. And
yeah.
and I should imagine it was probably so disorganized afterwards. It wasn't like today where everything's recorded and we've computerized and digitalized and everything. It's
Well, even now, the Israelis are finding people who died on the 7th of October who they thought were missing, and
yes, right.
find the piece that the information together.
So really, anti-Semitism has been broiling even before Israel was created, and it magnified itself after the coup, the Rashid Ali al-Gailani coup and pro-Nazi attack. So as it's all over. It has been there, well stated. Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, you make a very good point. And Professor Karen points out that the murders didn't just occur in Baghdad. Right, sort of. I think there's
a message here from your relative.
yeah,
in
my
Japan.
uncle had a story about the Farhud and how they were paid for mercenaries to demonstrate against the Jews in Baghdad. Yeah, well, that hasn't changed. I think the Palestinian Solidarity Movement is still being paid. So in Basra, Jews were injured and murdered. Yeah, we mustn't forget the fact that this was an Iraq-wide phenomenon, the Farhud, not just Baghdad. Absolutely. So I think if there are no more comments or questions, Michelle, shall we wrap up?
Okay, we can open up if anybody wants to, whatever, but that's fine. Yeah.
Shall we do as we usually do and bring the official proceedings to an end? And perhaps just promote our next event. I can see Jay Prosser has just left a message. Well, Jay Prosser is going to be the presenter of our next event. He's just written a book called Loving Strangers, about his family, which spanned Iraq, India, Singapore, and China. So don't miss that in 2 weeks' time on the 18th of June. And after that, we wind down a little bit for the summer. There'll only be one talk in July and one in August. And then we resume every 2 weeks in September. So the advertisements are supposed to be coming up.
Have you seen them?
No, I can only see.
You should see them. You've got the advertisements. You've got all these advertisements.
Ah, there we go. So our talk in July is going to be about how do Sephardi communities observe Tisha B'Av. So, I'd like some audience participation there. Anyone who has memories of how Tisha B'Av was observed in their community in Arab countries, welcome to, have your say. So before we go, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And if anyone wants to say something, I think Lawrence will be unmuting everybody.
I can see Arlene there, so that's a hi to Arlene.
You have your fan club, Michelle.
Everyone can now mute themselves.
One fan.
More than one.